There are moments in history when an ordinary object becomes a vessel for extraordinary secrets. This is the story of one such moment, hidden in plain sight for nearly a century. It begins in a small archive room in New England, where a restorer named Margaret carefully examines a wooden radio from 1926. The object seems unremarkable at first: a polished mahogany cabinet with Art Deco trim, a dial face with station numbers printed in faded gold leaf, and a cloth speaker grill stained with age. But Margaret has spent 30 years learning to read the language of forgotten things, and she knows that radiophonic devices from this era often held secrets their makers never intended to preserve. She begins her meticulous examination as afternoon light filters through the archive's tall windows, dust particles catching the beam like suspended time itself. "Where are you calling from? I want to know." Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. The radio's back panel is secured with 6 brass screws, each one oxidized to a greenish patina that speaks of decades undisturbed. As Margaret carefully removes them, one by one, she feels the weight of historical responsibility. These devices were mass-produced, meant to be disposable entertainment for American households. Thousands made, most long since discarded or destroyed. The fact that this one survived suggests someone valued it enough to keep it, to pass it down, to preserve it even as the world moved forward into newer technologies. She opens the panel and her breath catches. Inside, beneath the vacuum tubes and transformer coils, someone has carved words into the wooden frame. The letters are small, deliberate, made with what appears to be a pocket knife or similar tool. The wood grain has darkened around the cuts, making them stand out against the lighter interior. Margaret reaches for her magnifying glass, her hands trembling slightly. She has found hidden messages before, names scratched into furniture, dates carved into beams, but there is always a moment of electric anticipation when encountering a voice from the past speaking directly to her across the decades. The carved text reads, "For my daughter Eleanor, so she might hear the voices we are not allowed to speak. May she understand what they tried to silence." 1926. Margaret sits back in her chair, the magnitude of this discovery settling over her like a weight. She pulls out her research materials, archives from the 1920s, newspaper databases, census records, birth certificates, and begins searching for Eleanor. The name is common enough that thousands of results appear, but Margaret knows how to narrow a search using contextual clues. The radio's construction style, the materials, the electrical specifications suggest it was handmade by someone with technical knowledge. Someone who built a radio not just to receive mainstream broadcasts, but perhaps to receive something else entirely. She spends the next 3 hours cross-referencing name combinations, Eleanor with M.H., surnames from the northeastern United States in that era. The possibilities multiply, thousands of possibilities. But then she finds something that makes her pause. An Eleanor Hartwell, born 1924 in Hartford, Connecticut, to Margaret Hartwell and an unnamed father. The birth certificate lists the mother's occupation as seamstress and contains no paternal information beyond a line that simply reads, "Unknown." This Eleanor Hartwell lived until 1998, a long life for someone born in the 1920s. Margaret traces her path through census records, newspaper archives, and property registries. Eleanor married at age 21, had 3 children, and lived a quiet, respectable life in the same region where the radio was discovered. She maintained her mother's maiden name in some documents even after marriage, a detail that Margaret knows was uncommon and therefore significant. It speaks to a woman who wanted to maintain a connection to her mother's identity, her mother's choices. The mystery deepens when Margaret discovers that Eleanor donated the contents of her home to a local historical society in 1995, just 3 years before her death. Her inventory lists household items, furniture, books, and, significantly, a collection of phonograph records and a wooden radio. The radio's serial number matches the one Margaret now holds in her hands. This is the same object, the same voice from the past, following a direct line from Margaret Hartwell, who carved the message, through her daughter Eleanor, and now to Margaret the Restorer, separated by nearly a century but connected through this single technological artifact. Margaret begins researching Margaret Hartwell specifically now, digging deeper into the birth certificates, marriage records, employment registers, and newspaper archives from the 1920s. What emerges is a portrait of a woman living in a time of profound social upheaval. The Roaring Twenties were celebrated for jazz, flappers, and the promise of modernity, but beneath that glamorous surface, America was a country fractured by racial violence, immigration restrictions, class warfare, and rigid moral codes. Women were just beginning to gain the right to vote, having secured the 19th Amendment only in 1920. Birth control was illegal in most states. Interracial relationships were not just socially forbidden but in many places criminalized. Margaret Hartwell, born in the 1890s according to the radio's construction timeline, would have been a young woman during the First World War and came of age in the early 1920s. The fact that she was a seamstress, a skilled trade, suggests she had some independence, some ability to support herself. But the absence of a named father on Eleanor's birth certificate, the careful concealment written into that official document, suggests something far more complicated than simply being an unwed mother, though that alone would have been devastating to a woman's reputation in that era. Margaret finds an old newspaper clipping from 1924 that changes everything. It is from a Hartford community newspaper, a small announcement of a seamstress for hire named M. Hartwell, advertising skills in fine tailoring and alterations. The announcement runs for 3 months in the 1924 issues, then disappears. Margaret cross-references this with property records and discovers that Margaret Hartwell rented a small apartment above a fabric shop from 1923 to 1928, exactly the period when Eleanor would have been born and when the radio was constructed. The shop owner was a man named James Chen, a Chinese immigrant who had established the fabric business in 1920 despite the Chinese Exclusion Act still being in effect. A wave of recognition passes through Margaret. She understands now what the carved message into the radio truly means, what secrets it was designed to preserve, what voice the radio was meant to help Eleanor hear. In the 1920s, a relationship between a Chinese immigrant man and a white American woman would have been not just socially catastrophic but potentially dangerous. Such relationships were illegal in many states under miscegenation laws. The child born from such a union would have had no legal status, no claim to either parent's family name, no social standing whatsoever. Eleanor, born in 1924, would have been the living evidence of a forbidden love, a love that could not be publicly acknowledged, could not be legally recognized, could not exist in the official records of a deeply racist society. The birth certificate that lists Eleanor's father as unknown is not an oversight. It is a deliberate protection, a kind of legal armor designed to shield both mother and child from the consequences of living in a world that deemed their family's existence immoral and illegal. Margaret searches for more information about James Chen and discovers that he disappeared from property records in 1928, the same year Margaret Hartwell's rental agreement ends. She finds a ship manifesto from 1929 listing a James Chen departing from Boston, bound for Shanghai. The annotations on the document suggest he was being deported, though the official record uses the language of voluntary return. Margaret can read between those bureaucratic lines. In 1928, exactly 4 years after Eleanor's birth, James Chen was forced to leave the country, separated from his daughter and from the woman he loved by an immigration system designed to eliminate Asian American communities from American soil. Margaret Hartwell kept the radio, and in 1926, while James was still present, still in their lives, though increasingly in danger, she carved that message into the wooden frame. She was creating a historical record, a testimony, a way of speaking truth to power through the very device that was supposed to deliver only the approved voices of mainstream broadcast media. She was building something subversive. She was building a father's voice into a radio so that Eleanor, growing up without him, could at least know that he had existed, that their family had existed, that their love had been real even if the world denied it. The 1926 radio itself becomes significant in this context. This was not an easy thing to build. Commercial radios existed, yes, but they were expensive. A handmade radio suggests technical knowledge, suggests time, suggests intentionality. James Chen, working in a fabric shop, would not have the obvious resources to build a radio. But Margaret Hartwell, with her skills in fine tailoring, would have had access to thin wires, to understanding thread counts and tension, to the delicate work required. Perhaps they built it together. Perhaps James taught Margaret the electrical theory while she contributed her own understanding of precision work. Or perhaps Margaret built it entirely, learning the technical skills specifically to create this object, this vessel for hidden history. Either way, the radio becomes an artifact of their love, a physical manifestation of the work they did to maintain connection across the barriers of a society determined to separate them. Margaret the restorer discovers that the radio, despite its age and the crude nature of the carvings, is actually in remarkable condition. The vacuum tubes still function, though they glow with the orange warmth of age. The electrical wiring, despite being nearly a century old, maintains its integrity. When Margaret carefully powers it on, using a modern step-down transformer to protect the delicate innards from electrical surge, the device crackles to life. The speaker produces the ghostly whisper of static, the sound of the electromagnetic spectrum itself, and then gradually, a voice emerges. It is a woman's voice, broadcasting from a local station, reading news from 1926. Margaret stops, stunned. The radio is not just a mechanical object. It is a time machine, a direct connection to the sounds of that era. She can hear, through this device that James and Margaret built together, what Eleanor would have heard as a small child. She can hear the voices of 1926, the approved voices, the broadcast voices, the official narrative of American life. But she understands now what the carved message means. The radio was built to receive those official broadcasts, yes, but it was also built as a monument to everything the official broadcasts would never acknowledge. The existence of James Chin, the existence of interracial love, the existence of a child born from that love, the reality of a family that society had deemed impossible. Margaret begins a comprehensive documentation of her findings. She photographs the radio from every angle, creates detailed measurements, catalogs the vacuum tubes by their production codes, maps the electrical path through the circuit. She transcribes the carved message exactly as it appears, preserving the spelling, the punctuation, the slight variations in letter depth. She compiles all her research into Eleanor Hartwell's life, her descendants, her history. Through genealogical records, she locates Eleanor's grandchildren, living descendants of James Chin and Margaret Hartwell, people who carry both names in their genealogy but may not know the full story of how they came to exist, how their family came to exist in a society that tried to erase them. She reaches out to them carefully, respectfully, aware that she is about to deliver historical truth that may rewrite their understanding of their family's past. The response is profound. One of Eleanor's grandsons, a man named David Chin, responds to Margaret's inquiry with a letter that says his grandmother Eleanor had always been mysterious about her father, had refused to discuss him with her children, had kept certain documents locked away until her death. David had spent years wondering about the missing piece of his family history. He had studied Asian American history, had learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act and the miscegenation laws, had made educated guesses about what might have happened, but he had never had confirmation. The radio, the carved message, the documented evidence that Margaret had assembled, these finally provided the answer. David brings the radio to a museum, along with Eleanor's personal documents and photographs, including a small portrait of James Chen that Eleanor had kept hidden, along with letters from the 1920s written in Chinese characters that turn out to be love letters from James to Eleanor. Poetry written about a love that could not exist in the official world but existed absolutely in the private spaces where they found each other. The restoration of the radio becomes a public event. Historians and Asian American studies scholars examine the object, verify Margaret's research, and place it in its proper historical context. The radio goes on permanent display with an extensive exhibition about interracial relationships in 1920s America, about the laws that criminalized them, about the immigrant communities that faced systematic exclusion and deportation, about the ways ordinary people resisted by loving across impossible boundaries, by building monuments in wood and wire to their forbidden families. The exhibition becomes a powerful statement about the hidden histories of America, the stories that were deliberately erased from official records, the voices that could not broadcast themselves on mainstream media and so had to be preserved in other ways. Carved into wood, hidden in attics, locked away in documents, passed down through family silence until someone finally asked the right questions. Eleanor's legacy becomes visible. She lived to be 74 years old, long enough to know that her father had returned to China, that he had lived, that he had loved her. She named her own daughter Margaret, in honor of her mother, creating a generational chain of women named Margaret connected to the woman who carved the original message. Through Eleanor's grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the family continued, survived, thrived. They became Americans and Chinese Americans both, carrying dual heritage that society had said was impossible, making that impossibility real through their very existence. Margaret the Restorer becomes the person most associated with telling this story. She gives talks at universities, contributes to scholarly articles, helps develop the exhibition text. She works with David Chen and his family to ensure that the story is told with the proper respect, the proper context, the proper acknowledgement of what their ancestors sacrificed and endured. She learns that historical restoration is not just about preserving physical objects but about preserving and amplifying the hidden stories that those objects carry. She understands that every artifact in an archive is potentially a message in a bottle, a voice calling out across time, asking to be heard. The radio itself continues to function, played occasionally during public programs, so that visitors can hear what Eleanor heard as a child, can connect directly to the soundscape of 1926, can feel the ghostly presence of the electromagnetic waves that James and Margaret built this device to capture. When the radio is powered on during exhibitions, people stand silent, listening to the crackle and whisper of voices from nearly a century ago, and many report feeling emotional, feeling as if they are hearing something forbidden, something dangerous, something that should not exist but does. And in those moments, they are hearing it correctly. They are hearing the love that society tried to erase. They are hearing the family that was declared impossible. They are hearing James Chen and Margaret Hartwell and Eleanor, all speaking through the medium that was never supposed to carry their voices, all present in the space between the static and the signal, all alive in the evidence of their own existence. The 1926 radio, ordinary in appearance but extraordinary in its hidden testimony, remains as a monument to the power of love to persist, to create, to build lasting monuments even in the face of a society determined to deny that such love could ever exist. It is a radio that received more than just broadcasts. It received and preserved the truth of a family's being, and through Margaret's careful work nearly a century later, it broadcast that truth into the world, finally giving voice to the voices that were never allowed to speak, finally making heard the message that James and Margaret had carved into wood and hope and defiance so many years before, that they were real, they loved, they built, and they endured in the hearts and lives of those who came after them. But the story does not end with the radio's discovery. In the years following the museum exhibition, Margaret the Restorer receives letters from all over the world. People write to her about their own families, their own hidden histories, their own artifacts that carry carved messages and secret testaments. A woman from California writes that her grandmother's jewelry box contains initials engraved on the inside, initials that match a man who was deported from the country before she was born. A man from the Pacific Northwest describes a quilt in his family collection with a particular pattern that repeats throughout, and when he finally researched the pattern, he discovered it was a coded message using traditional Chinese embroidery techniques, a way of communicating across impossible distances. A teenager from Texas tells Margaret that after seeing the radio story, she finally had the courage to ask her mother about her father's name, a name that had been deliberately withheld from all family documents, and discovered her family's own history of separation and survival. These letters reveal a massive hidden landscape of American history, a terrain of interracial relationships that persisted despite every legal and social barrier erected to prevent them. They show that the radio was not unique in this regard. It was one of countless monuments that ordinary people built to preserve their loves, their families, their very existence in a society that denied their right to exist. Margaret begins a research project to document these stories, to create an archive of artifacts that carry hidden testimonies about forbidden relationships and the families they created. She partners with universities, with historical societies, with community organizations. They develop protocols for examining artifacts respectfully, for interviewing descendants, for contextualizing these objects within the broader history of immigration restriction, racial violence, and systematic erasure. She discovers that between the 1880s and the 1960s, when miscegenation laws were still in effect across much of the country, there existed an entire parallel society of mixed-race families living in legal invisibility, their children's birth certificates marked with false information, their relationships criminalized, their very existence denied by official documentation. Yet these families persisted. They built homes, raised children, created art, constructed monuments in wood and wire and thread to testify to their own reality. Some of these objects survive, hidden in attics, locked in storage units, kept carefully by families who understood they were preserving dangerous truth. One of the most striking discoveries comes when Margaret receives a package from an elderly man in New York. Inside are photographs, dozens of them, from the 1920s and 1930s showing what appears to be the same household photographed repeatedly over years. A woman, a man, and a growing number of children appear in these photographs, always formal, always posed in the style of that era, always with a particular solemnity that seems to speak to the weight of their reality. The man is Asian, likely Chinese or Korean. The woman is white. The children, growing from infants to young adults across the years, show the clear physical evidence of their mixed heritage. On the back of each photograph, in careful handwriting, are dates and names: Eleanor, James, Margaret Jr., Daniel, Rose, Thomas. The man who sent the package is Daniel's grandson, and he explains that these photographs were kept hidden by his family for nearly a century. His grandfather Daniel had never publicly acknowledged his father James or his Chinese heritage, had married a white woman and had tried to live as if his origins didn't matter. But he had kept these photographs, had passed them down through his will to be opened only after his death, a final testification to the family he had been forced to deny during his lifetime. Margaret receives permission to include these photographs in the exhibition, and their impact is immediate and overwhelming. Visitors stand before these images and see, for the first time in many cases, visual proof that mixed-race families existed in America during an era when they were considered impossible, illegal, immoral. The photographs become tools of historical education, evidence that cannot be argued with or dismissed. They show the ordinary reality of people living extraordinary lives under extraordinary constraints. They show children growing up, families building themselves despite the legal apparatus designed to prevent their existence. A photograph from 1928 shows Eleanor at age 4, standing between her mother and a man identified on the back simply as James, of course, captured in the final years before his deportation. His hand rests gently on Eleanor's shoulder. His face shows the combination of love and sorrow that comes from knowing the time with your child is limited, that separation is coming, that you are building memories that will have to sustain your child through a lifetime of absence. The exhibition expands to include these new materials, and museums across the country request to host traveling versions. The radio travels with it, displayed alongside the photographs, the letters, the embroidered quilts, the secret messages carved into furniture. Together, these objects tell a story that American history textbooks have barely begun to address. The story of love persisting across racial boundaries despite systematic legal opposition, the story of families creating themselves in the margins of legality, the story of ordinary people becoming architects of resistance simply by insisting on their right to love, to build, to exist. Margaret gives a talk at a major American history conference about the methodologies of discovering hidden histories through artifact analysis, and her work becomes foundational to a new field of study focused on the material culture of resistance and the ways that ordinary objects become vessels for suppressed testimonies. Young historians begin their own projects inspired by her work, searching through attics and antique shops and estate sales for objects that carry carved messages, searching through family papers for the gaps that indicate missing relationships, searching through the archives for the people whose names were deliberately left off of documents. The impact on the Chin family descendants is profound and transformative. For generations, Eleanor's children had been confused about their identity, had been told contradictory stories about their grandfather, had inherited a sense of shame that they could not quite name. Some had chosen to identify exclusively as white and had attempted to erase their Chinese heritage entirely. Others had felt a persistent pull toward Asian American communities despite having no official connection to them, a kind of genetic memory of identity that had been stolen from them by forced separation and legal erasure. The discovery of James Chen's existence, the documentation of his deportation, the recovery of his letters and poetry, creates the possibility of healing. David Chen, Eleanor's grandson, begins learning Mandarin Chinese as an adult, something he says he always felt drawn to but had never had the courage to pursue. He travels to Shanghai and attempts to trace his grandfather's final years, discovering that James Chen had returned to his native village, had married again, had had another family, had lived until 1968. James Chen's descendants in China, Eleanor's cousins and their children, have survived the Cultural Revolution and are building their own lives. When David meets his Chinese relatives for the first time, he brings photographs of Eleanor, of James and Margaret, of the radio. He brings copies of the love letters written in Chinese characters. He brings the evidence of a family that had been split across continents by history but that had never ceased to exist. The reunion is emotional and significant. David's Chinese cousins meet Eleanor's grandchildren, and together they piece together the full story of James Chen's life, split between two continents, between two loves, between the family he was forced to abandon and the family he created after exile. The radio becomes a symbol of this trans-Pacific reconciliation, a device that was built to capture voices across distance, and that ultimately served as a tool for capturing and preserving the voices and memories of a family separated by continents and decades. Margaret the Restorer, present at these events as a kind of documentarian and witness, finds herself deeply moved by the way her careful archival work has created the conditions for healing, for the recovery of identity, for the restoration of dignity to people whose ancestors had been deliberately erased from history. She understands that her role as a historian is not neutral, that the work of preserving history is always also the work of speaking against erasure, of insisting on the reality of those whom society had declared non-existent. She writes a book about the radio and the methods of discovering hidden histories through artifact analysis. The book becomes widely read in academic circles and in popular culture. It inspires more people to look carefully at the objects in their own families, to ask difficult questions about the gaps in official records, to consider what might be hidden in plain sight. Museums across the country begin examining their collections with renewed attention to these questions. Curators start reaching out to descendant communities to ask whether family stories might contextualize certain artifacts in new ways. The work that Margaret began with a single radio and a careful examination of carved wood has rippled outward to reshape the way Americans think about their history. Years pass. Margaret eventually retires from active restoration work, but she continues to consult, to write, to mentor younger historians in the methods of discovering and preserving hidden histories. The 1926 radio, now one of the most famous artifacts in the country, remains on permanent display in a major museum, and thousands of people pass before it each year. Many leave it in tears, moved by the story, moved by what it represents, moved by the knowledge that such resistance and such love existed in their own country's past. School groups visit the exhibition and learn about the miscegenation laws, about the Chinese Exclusion Act, about the ways that ordinary people resisted these systems by continuing to love, to build families, to create monuments to their own reality. Some of those students go on to become historians themselves, inspired by the questions that the radio raises about what other stories are hidden, what other artifacts carry messages that have never been heard, what other voices are waiting to be amplified after centuries of silence. The radio's dial still functions, though the stations it once broadcast have long since disappeared, replaced by new technologies, new media, new ways of communicating across distance. But sometimes, when it is powered on during exhibitions, visitors report hearing something more than just the crackling static and the faint voices of the past. Some say they hear music, old jazz recordings from the 1920s, the kind of music that James and Margaret might have listened to together in their hidden moments of intimacy. Others report hearing a woman's voice, speaking gently, telling a story, though no one can quite make out the words. Whether this is a real phenomenon, an acoustic artifact of the radio's construction, or whether it is the power of suggestion and emotion overwhelming sensory perception, remains unclear. But what is clear is that the radio has become more than an object. It has become a conduit, a space where past and present intersect, where the voices that were supposed to remain silent finally find a way to speak. The carved message inside the radio, for my daughter Eleanor, so she might hear the voices we are not allowed to speak, has been realized far beyond what Margaret and James could have imagined. Eleanor heard those voices, and she passed them on to her children, and they passed them on to the world, and now millions of people hear them, understand them, are changed by them. The 1926 radio, ordinary in appearance but extraordinary in its testimony, stands as a permanent reminder that history is not just what appears in official documents. History is also written in wood and wire, in carved messages, in hidden objects, in the artifacts that ordinary people create to testify to their own existence, their own love, their own right to be real in a world that tried to deny them.